Okay, so module 3, team and financials or execution. The last module will be on valuation very briefly, and then mostly the pitch deck structure. Again, what makes a startup investable in a broader sense is just 4 things really. It's unique value proposition where I can understand what your product market fit is. It has to be an attractive market size. It has to be big enough. Your beachhead is small enough for you to really tailor it and attack the market, but then I can see your SAM growing. And I need to understand that the SAM is big enough again. TAM, as I told you before, no one almost looks at the TAM. It's always a big number, hopefully. Otherwise, you're not even in the running. So the team that can execute is a key issue, and a lot of times you will hear that that's the most important thing. That's how investors make their decision. Now, I'm putting it in number 3 on the list because team is tightly linked to your unique value proposition, your market size, and your go-to-market strategy. You can have an excellent team, but if it doesn't match with either what need you're solving or how you're going to go to market, there's a mismatch. The team can only execute on what you said your strategy is. So you have a team that every member of the team is linked to some execution part of the strategy. And again, go-to-market is the biggest one. And finally, it needs to make money for investors. That's why we talk about valuation. We will talk about it next time, because if your valuation is through the roof, it doesn't matter how good the team is or the value prop, you're just not attractive to an investor. Okay, advisory boards and executive teams. So let's talk about that. So the main purpose of advisory boards for startups versus late stage, there is a difference. At the beginning, so as an investor, when I'm looking at the deck and I'm looking at the advisory board, I'm looking at what is missing on the executive team, because the executive team at that stage is usually small. And does the advisory board fill in those gaps? The other thing I'm looking for is, will that advisory board open up the Rolodex? So the mistakes that sometimes we see is startups will put a lot of advisors on their board that are just, they're personal advisors. They may be your professors, they may be someone who can really advise you on the business side, but they're not in the particular area that you're in. So they can provide general advice, but they don't have the Rolodex to help you with sales and go to market. That would be a big minus. Sometimes, startups ask, well, can I put you on the advisory board because, as an SBDC consultant, you're sort of instrumental. You're with me, every week. You're helping. The answer is no. Partially because we have a conflict of interest policy, but partially is because I'm not there to drive you forward the same way that advisory board is. I'm working with too many startups and I'm spread too thin, and investors know it. So anytime you put anyone like an SBDC consultant or your accelerator consultant, it really doesn't hold the same weight, because they know, an investor knows, if someone is a mentor at an accelerator, they're spread thin. They will help a little bit, but they're not they should not be your core advisory board. For the late stage, that can change. That's really not about sometimes about the Rolodex. It's about the execution, right? So as a CEO, you need an advisory board that can help you scale the business up. You're no longer sort of impressing the investors. You just need a really solid number of people whom you can tap into. And by then, you also have a lot of advisors who came because they got an advisory board because they're on your investor team. If they did not become part of the board, they might be an advisory board. So the qualifications, that's what I mean by qualifications. At the startup stage, are they willing to take your call, open up their Rolodex, and do they look impressive to investors where it's convincing that they would be helpful? Compensation varies at the beginning. Sometimes you have advisory board on the slide that is not compensated yet, which is okay. But the closer you move on being funded and beyond, you need to start talking about the compensation. It can be anywhere from 1% to 3%. It all depends on how much they're contributing. And again, investors know no one wants to see a great advisory team that all is getting 5% of equity, because your cap table will look horrible. Everyone's going to get diluted, and before you know it, it's not investable anymore. So be very careful with compensation. Also make it contingent on performance. Use cliffs, meaning if they stop performing and they get off the board early, nothing gets vetted, nothing gets vested, sorry. Okay, so this is the team sample slide. Where do you put it in the deck? We'll talk more about it next time when we talk about the pitch deck and its structure. There are rare cases where you would have the team at the very beginning, and that's only when you have such a strong team that investors know these people, or they're so impressed that they're basically willing to write a check without listening to the rest of the pitch. So you always have to ask yourself, can I convince investor that the team is so strong because they had multiple startups, they had multiple exits, they're very known in their space, and investors would be familiar with those startups and those exits. And there's such a track record that literally you kind of make up your mind that, wow, unless it's a really bad pitch, I'm investing, because just investing on the team. Otherwise, your team slide is always towards the end. Once you explain the business model, once you explain go-to-market strategy, because that is critical, right? If it doesn't match, again, there has to be a match. This is the sample of how you structure the deck. Always put pictures. We see sometimes team slides that don't have pictures. You're really doing yourself a disservice. When someone's writing you a check, they want to see faces. Now, here, obviously, I have avatars because I don't have real people on the, for this company. Another time when you would use an avatar is once you articulate who your team is and everyone is on their executive team on the slide. Let's say you need to hire a business development guy or girl. Put down an avatar and put it down TBD. Again, investor wants to know that you realize that you don't have that person yet, but you will bring them on board. What you put underneath the name and the title, it's what is relevant. So again, 2 successful exits, that's relevant. 15 years in the industry, that's relevant. The entire resume is not that relevant. And sometimes because you don't have a lot of space, you want to maximize it. Now, in the written deck, because you will be submitting a written deck and competing on it, you have the luxury of going a little bit deeper. But again, don't get carried away. It's not a resume. It's really, you're trying to articulate only the points that are relevant for this particular startup. So 2 successful exits would always be relevant because someone is running a startup, not a corporation. You have to be creative when you don't have something to support, right? Like you don't have someone who had 2 successful exits, right? Well, be creative. What have they done? Maybe they worked multiple in multiple roles in multiple companies. Again, try to figure out what is relevant and what would impress the investor. Emily, can I have you answer that question? When is the written deck due? Oops, you muted.
The written deck is due July 5th, the Tuesday after July 4th.
Okay. So John, did you get that? That was your question. Okay. July 5th. Awesome. Okay. So again, you have your team sample slide in front of you here. That'll be your executive team. The following team slide would be your advisory board, structured the same way. You always want to have a mix between business and tech. So that's another sort of area where you really have to watch. And if you need to have those TBDs, those avatars, then put them on, because if I see as an investor, if I'm looking at the deck with the team slide being all towards the tech or clinical, there's no one on the business side. And I'm hoping that you will get them. I'm feeling more reassured if you put the TBD with specific titles. I'm more reassured if the advisory board has that business mix. But again, sometimes we do get it where it's all clinical and tech on the executive team, and it's all clinical and tech on the advisory board. Big mistake, because you just can't do that unless you're doing, I should clarify that. If you are doing, let's say it's a compound, and you're bringing, it's a molecule, whatever. Yes, you can be heavy on the science, because at this point you get an acquisition before you go to market. Any questions on the advisory board or executive team?
Oh, that makes sense.
Someone unmuted.
Oh, I just said that makes sense. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Welcome. So let's move to the more details. So when you have to identify your team gaps, right? We talked about it, like the TBDs, the avatars. You need to know where they are. Also, you need to think about incentives for key hires and equity compensation issues. At the beginning, obviously, everyone wants to get paid, right? So if you're looking for, for CTO, and he wants, 150K or 200K, it's not going to fly. It's not going to fly with investors. No, I'm talking about the seed round. I'm talking about the earlier stages. Like once you're in Series B, Series C, yes, you've already proven yourself. You can be much more generous with compensations. But at the beginning, especially if your first pitch is to angel groups, those 150K hires do not fly. So you need to, even a CEO may not get more than 60K. So you really have to, put that down on at the beginning when you have conversations. A lot of times you will hear, well, once you raise money, I will come on board. And they're hoping that you will raise, if you raise $1 million, you will hand them, 150K that they were asking for. No, the answer is no, because when you pitch, you are telling investors what those compensations will be, and they're not going to go for those compensation levels. So incentives always have to be, the equity should be there. Again, it should be, vested over time. It should be very clear what they will do. The way you compensate, you analyze if someone is working for free, basically not taking salary, how much are they contributing, and based on that, it's you deciding the compensation, the equity compensation. You always want to make sure that someone is looking at the cap table, and you are aware of what's going on. How much those people will cost you when you hire them, and how much equity they will have. As a CEO, you need to have control. The more raises you have, the more diluted everyone gets. So it's critical, but you need to allocate options for your team. This is just a quick, if you're working with an HR professional, you will get a real view into how much it will cost you to hire a person. So here, if you see total cash compensation is 79, right? Now, when you actually look at the compensation with all the bells and whistles and all the perks, the non-compensation is 20, is almost 21K. So your total cash plus non-cash, by the time you paid all the the insurances, the taxes on it, is 100K. That's a big difference. That's a 20K difference, and that's just one person. So again, always do those calculations. Don't just throw in a number like, okay, someone agreed to work for 80K. Great, I'm just going to throw 80K on the slide and worry about it later. Because you will run out of money very quickly. Other things to consider when you bring on a team on board and advisors is always the liability and intellectual property. So liability, again, make sure that the contracts are clear. Make sure that IP is always assigned to the company. Now, it's a different issue when you have university IP, transfer, and then you're working with those parameters. But all the employees have to, and co-founders, everything IP related has to be super clean. Because if someone is walking away, and it's not clear that the IP is all left to the company, there's some gray area, investors would absolutely walk away. Other things is 1099s versus W-2 employees. California, if you are operating in California, is very fussy about it. So make sure that you don't have someone you misrepresenting, and you actually paying them 1099 when you should be paying them as a W-2. Again, investors look at it, and if it's messy, if there's any labor disputes that might come up, again, they can walk away. All with non-exempt versus exempt, it's really nice to have an HR professional take a look. Now, Hedy, I want to ask you quickly, if you don't mind, because you started working with Insperity. How was that experience, and have you changed? Is there anything that you guys are working on? Anything that was a surprise, or you can share?
Well, since we have employees in different states, it was way more complicated than I was expecting, and we're still ironing it out. So I would say when you're bringing on salaried employees, getting a firm to help you, I mean, I can't even believe I thought I might be able to handle it. There is just no way because every state has different laws, so it might be different for somebody else, but I just found out that, you have to pay into different insurances for your employees. For instance, there's paid family leave in Massachusetts, which we were lacking. And so that was a surprise, how complicated working everything out is, and also how expensive it is on the company side, all the things you have to pay in that you might not be expecting.
And again, a lot of times when you're early on and you're pitching to investors, you just don't calculate those things in. You don't factor them in. Again, Hedy, not to talk a lot about sort of the details of your business, but you guys had grant money, so there was a little more to to spread around, but it's still managing those grants is the same thing.
And actually that was helpful because they forced us to allocate funds. We didn't even understand. I mean, we really did have to allocate a certain percentage on top of the salary, and we thought, oh, we're not going to use that. I mean, we were really wrong.
Yeah, it's lawyers and HR professionals, they kind of they come in handy. They all cost a lot of money, but at the end, unfortunately, you just can't escape it.
And just one other thing I would say, in California, I'm presuming everybody here is in California, there's a lot of like you have to provide sexual harassment training to your employees. I mean, things that are unique to here also. That are a little bit stricter. And of course, we're in a lab, so there's lots of compliance issues that I just wasn't expecting.
One thing is, again, to just mention interns. Interns is a big deal too, and so many startups rely on interns. Be very, very, very careful. Actually, UCI Extension, Emily, I don't know if you keep track of that, but I think UCI Extension had a internship program where it's for out of country students who went through the UCI Extension business program certification, and that was a free internship, meaning it's free for the startup. I think it was a good number of hours, either 100 hours or 200 hours. But that was controlled by UCI Extension. So that was a really good opportunity. But for the most part, you have to pay your interns. Again, unless they're doing academic work and you really then teaching them and they're getting experience. But again, then it has to be coordinated with the college or university. Hedy, you did not use interns, have you?
We haven't. I actually can you elaborate? Because we want to, and now you've got me thinking, what is difficult about interns? I mean, that is something, that's our next step, actually.
If you're paying them, it's not that difficult. Oh, John, you wanted to say something too?
Yeah, I've used a couple different intern programs, and so, you know, to your point, if they weren't receiving college credit, I had to make sure I was paying them, and if they were getting credit, then it could be unpaid.
Was it relatively easy for you when you were just paying them? That was pretty straightforward, or
Yeah,
there
and it was a 1099. I just treated them as a consultant.
no 1099? Were you a So that's a little bit, yeah. Again, I'm not a lawyer or HR professional, so I'm going to just kind of ask you maybe even when you had to consider whether they're really truly 1099 based on California law. 1099 has a lot of freedom to do work that you cannot tell them what to do. So
yeah, it worked out pretty well. We just really treated them as a consultant.
okay. Because the laws changed, and it can be 20. I can't remember the numbers, but there were a lot of rules about 1099s where they really did not want you. Basically, they had to have freedom how to execute, what time they worked. You couldn't tell them to follow specific protocol. Again, it kind of gets messy. A lot of times, let's face it, we just kind of wing it. And 1099, they come and go, and nothing happens. But if it ever happens, it can get messy. You just want to make sure, because they're intern, by definition, they need a lot of guidance, right? John, did you use yours for administrative or sort of a little bit more dipping into clinical?
Engineering. So the Masters of Engineering program just finished through UCI. So I had 3 interns for that, and then this summer there's another one that I'm using.
Another sort of resource that we do have through UCI is capstone projects. And those can be successful too. They have their pros and cons, but basically that would be free for the company, right? You're approaching UCI saying, I would, as a startup, I would like to put forward a project, and then interns work on that project. So sometimes it's multidisciplinary, like engineering school, I know does that heavily. I know computer department too participates. So it's a good way to do it, and they have quite a lot of freedom to do it. You can guide them, and you have to meet almost, I would say, every week. Some of the requirements, weekly meetings. Westcliff University also has that program for capstone projects, where they can write the entire business plan for you, do competitive analysis. There's a lot they can do. It's just a matter, they are supervised by their professors, so they're trying to do the best they can, and there is some sort of check and balance. But there's a lot of room for error, and you really have to kind of double check. You can't just rely on that research. I've seen some groups perform extremely well, and I think engineering and would be a little bit easier. But again, if you're unsure about the business side and you just need someone to dig through competitive analysis, it's just a good starting point. I would never say have interns do a capstone project and then get the document and rely on it 100%. It's just a starting point. But again, it's just helpful because all of a sudden you have those numbers like TAM, SAM, SOM we talked about last week. You have to calculate those numbers. You have to get the industry numbers. Students, a lot of times they have access to all the databases, for example, through UCI or Westcliff, where normally it's a paid database. You don't actually have access to it. So that's another benefit of tapping into students. Okay, so the part about financial, so it makes money for investors, right? So we'll kind of talk about a little bit about financials, and valuation will be for next time, and then we'll talk about the pitch deck. But But you can never tell a story in your pitch deck that doesn't end with financials. So financials is a big part of it, and you have to go into them relative. Once you cover the market size, once you cover your business model, that's the time for you to explain how the numbers line up, because the market can be big, but how much are you charging? Whom are you charging, and what do those numbers really look like? So what drives your revenue? You have to some of it you will explain in due diligence. So in a pitch, you have to explain enough and show enough that investor or the judge is looking at it knowing that you've actually done the homework. It is rare that in the pitch you would be asked to explain a lot, especially if it's a competition type pitch. If it's an investor type pitch, you will get more answers. But again, the numbers just need to line up enough for you to get the second meeting. And then if they're interested, go into due diligence. In the due diligence, you are diving deep. So revenue drivers. So what is the price? What is the volume? And again, the volume is driven by activities, right? You need to explain, where that volume is coming from. Where's the demand? Is it growing? And then the growth rate. So is your market accelerating? Is there a demand that's constantly growing? So let's say senior population, right? Well, it's easy to say, well, that group is growing, so our numbers will only go up. You need to articulate cost of goods sold if you have them. Again, that's mostly for products. For services, you would put down, for example, commissions that you're paying if you have a sales force that's on commission only, because that'll be a variable cost, right? Like COGS, the only reason we separate COGS is because it's a variable cost. So if you're not producing as many units, then those expenses go down. Same thing with the commissions, right? If the volume of sales is X, then you have a specific number for commissions. If they're not selling, that number disappears. So again, those variable costs, they kind of live at the top. The operating expenses, a lot of times they are fixed. So that's why you want to separate those. Again, assets, not so much for early startups. You're not really talking about assets to a big extent, and you're not talking about, you're not making money off interest, you're not loaning money to anyone, so that does not exist. So how does the sample slide look like? There are two views on that. Some people prefer tables, some people prefer graphs. A lot of times you will hear, don't do the table during the fast pitch, just do a graph. No, it's easy to turn something into a graph. I like to start with a table. If you want to turn it into a graph, again, you have your COGS, costs, you have your revenue. What's nice about the table is, yes, no one is looking at it deep enough during your 5-minute pitch or 10-minute pitch. However, I know that you've done those calculations. When I see graphs, there's part of me that thinks, well, you played with numbers long enough for the graph to look pretty. Not to say that you didn't play long enough for the numbers in the table to look pretty, but there's just a little bit more visibility into it. So again, one thing that is not here, above net revenue, most of the times you would have your assumptions. And the reason I didn't put it here is because those assumptions are always different. So let's say that your revenue comes from B2C purchases, right? In this case, my assumptions is basically the number of customers. So I can put down, I need 1,000 units sold and my net revenue is X. However, a lot of times, let's say it's medical device. Well, you're not selling medical device to X number of physicians. You're going through hospitals, right? So really what I want to know as an investor is how many hospitals you need to close for you to have that volume of physicians who will be, either prescribing or using your device. So that would go above that net revenue row. Again, for me to eyeball how realistic your numbers are, like if I'm looking at net revenue and you're looking at the same table, like, is it good, is it bad? Is it realistic, is it not? I can't tell, because what I don't know is what do you need to do to get to that revenue? Maybe lucky you only need to make 3 sales to get to those numbers. And then, 6 sales next year, 10 sales the following year. Now, given your business model and knowing whom you sell to, I can eyeball how realistic it is. But without those assumptions, I'm blind. So I can't tell if it's a good deal, realistic deal. Now I can tell maybe it's a good deal if it pans out, but I can't tell how it's realistic. And you're really trying to be investable. You need to be very, very, realistic to hit those numbers that you're promising to hit. Again, you will always have those numbers higher than probably they will be. Everyone says that they have conservative numbers. It's kind of a joke among the investors. Like everyone says it's conservative. Just tune out, and we kind of smile. Now, it's funny because some of you are actually conservative, and some of you are like engineers, especially, or scientists, and you're like, no, I'm not overestimating. I'm just absolutely like on the, on the money, because I'm scared to put down any number that I cannot back up with data. But for the most part, even in those cases, it is still a wild guess. So everyone says it's conservative, just don't say it. The best way to present it is just say it's realistic. Because it's just a word that we tune out. So again, going down the line, so what do we have? We have net revenue, right? We put our assumptions at the top. Now we articulate our cost of goods sold. If we have that, we'll put down our margin. In the expenses, that would vary, but here's an example, right? A lot of you would have R&D, so you put that as a separate line item. You might put down actually regulatory and legal as a separate line item because it's just relevant to your industry. Otherwise, it's sales and marketing always should be there. Your salaries are probably rolled into it. So same thing with the R&D, the salaries are rolled into it. However, there are cases where you would not roll it in, you would just call it as a separate line item, salaries. You just have to have a story behind how you explain it. A lot of times rolling it in is actually more beneficial, because you might want to put head count as a separate line item and have that as a separate row. Again, it's case by case basis when it makes sense, when it doesn't make sense. And the last thing that you need to have is EBITDA. You don't need to calculate interest, taxes, depreciations, nothing, because that varies, and that varies from state to state. The reason investors only care about EBITDA is because everything else is how you play with those numbers, right? Like how you, where you incorporate in, in California or Delaware, right? Those are decisions that can be made. But what I want to do is I want to compare business to business, apple to apple. So before you play with any of those levers, I want to see what the business looks like. After that, we can play with those numbers, and and everyone will advise you how to minimize your taxes, maximize your profit, all those good things. But at the beginning, this is what I need. All I need is EBITDA. Okay. Any questions on that one?
Laura, I actually do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Are these, I see your gross margin percentages are 94% across the board, and EBITDA is 60% across the board. Are those actual calculations based on the numbers you have there? And is that usual?
Is that realistic? That was just a pitch deck slide that I grabbed. I did not analyze the numbers, so I'm sure they came from my Excel spreadsheet. But yeah, this is a complete sample. Now, this would be probably a SaaS model, right? If we're looking at those numbers. Also, it's in this case, it's kind of funny that my margins are staying stable, because they should theoretically improve over time, right?
Right. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And I would want to, hopefully I'm seeing those margins, increase. So I'm not starting with 94. Yeah. Good question. Again, as you can tell, we don't really look at those tables. We just like, okay, well, you have the numbers, great.
So when we're putting our tables together, we actually don't have any idea if it looks good or doesn't, or so we were looking around for good examples, you know, maybe not even in our industry, but what do these tables look like? If we wanted to see sample pitch deck slides of acceptable, or, you know, something that would look good to investors, is there some place we can look? Is there a resource or?
Yeah, so I would look into industry research because those come with financials for the companies in the industry, because it's very different, like diagnostics versus you know, medical device versus pharma versus software or digital health. The margins will be absolutely different. But if you go into the, you know, IBIS, for example, the industry research, right? They come with financials, and you can actually see what are the industry you know, norms. So that's a little bit of how you want to gauge, does it look reasonable or not? Because I have like, I hate those questions, because someone would, you know, come up with a financial deck and they would ask me, well, does it look good? How, you know, what do you want to see? I'm like, well, it's not what I want to see. It's what your business can or cannot do, right? As an investor, I mean, there's a level of, yes, there's something that I just don't want to see. So that's the valid, it's kind of funny, but that's a valid question to ask. What is it that you don't want to see, right? Well, what I don't want to see is, you know, small numbers. For example, the EBITDA, that's maybe only, you know, 5 million at the end of 5 years of, you know, getting revenue. Yes, I don't want to see it. But if you ask me a question, well, what do you want to see? Now I'm gonna back up and say, well, you tell me realistically what you can deliver, because it's not about what I want to see. There's certain things that I just don't want, and you become not investable. But the numbers can't be made up. Does it mean that we still don't play with the numbers to make them look better? Yeah, we do. But the story has to match, because at the end, like, you're raising money, it's real money. Someone is writing you a check, so you'd better think that realistically you can deliver. But yeah, I would say industry research is the one that you would look into. And again, the R&D you have to take it with, again, kind of a little bit of a grain of salt, because R&D at a big company may be actually, you know, public traded, maybe low, because they're just doing mergers and acquisitions. They're actually not, you know, they shrunk their R&D department for whatever, you know, reason, because it was advantageous. But yeah, industry research. And again, at you know, at SBDC, we do have our research department that does that work, and they can pull up those industry research reports. If you don't have, again, that intern that is still attached to the university, and then they can pull those numbers. Any other questions on the financial slide? The question that we get a lot is, do I need a financial slide? Because I'm planning to exit before I ever have to execute. And the answer is, it's very rare. If you bring a molecule, you're in ophthalmology, yes, you can actually have a deck with no financials. And what you would go by is exits. And the exits will all show, all the comparables will show that every single company exits once they get the clinical data in. However, if it's anything else, you just can't escape it. Even if you're dead sure that you will exit, when you negotiate your exit, you still need to negotiate it based on some numbers. Because if you're walking into negotiations saying, oh, I want 20 million, and they're saying, how about just 5? What do you need? How are you negotiating with them? Well, you're saying, well, you're going to make a ton of money with my product. Well, show me the numbers. How do you know I'm going to make that much money? We did our calculations, and by our calculations, we're not making that much money. So unless you play with the numbers, you really have a hard time. So you still need it. And again, investors want to see if you're acquired, why would someone acquire you? Again, they're acquiring you because they see the numbers and the numbers look attractive. Now, there are cases where someone would acquire you for strategic reasons, right? Like you making no revenue whatsoever, but they need to block someone. They're afraid that someone might buy you. You can think of like social media examples, right? There's nothing but eyeballs, but a company is bought for a lot of money, and there's no EBITDA, and there's nothing. There's still some calculations and there's some hope, and there's maybe just, you want to grab that market, but those are rare. So you really do have to make those numbers, work and calculate them. All right. So questions you might be asked either during the pitch or during due diligence. So sales activities and metrics. So we talked last time about go-to-market strategy. So when I'm looking at the financials, more so in a little bit in the due diligence, but it can still come up in the Q&A. So when you're on stage, you may be asked, so what sales activities you have and what are the metrics that you're using? You may be asked to talk about the independent sales force versus in-house. Did you play with those numbers? Does it make sense? Why are you going with one versus another? Again, I'm looking at the numbers. Do they add up? So customer acquisition cost, that's a big question. A lot of times it's also sales cycle. So I did not put it on it, but it really should be there, especially with hospitals. Well, how long is the sales cycle? The answer is long. It can be, you should be counting at least a year. If you already have some sales and you were able to get in quicker, you're lucky, and then you can use those numbers. But for the most part, again, you're being asked what is the sales cycle and what is the customer acquisition cost. Tricky in sometimes is that the CEO is actually making all the phone calls, so it looks like, well, there's no really customer acquisition cost. Well, the cost isn't time, right? Like how many sales can you make? So you still have to estimate, once the CEO is really doing what the CEO should be doing, which is making very few calls that are just critical, and then handing it off to the sales crew. How do those numbers look like? What is that customer acquisition cost? Salaries and wages. So I briefly managed that you can't get away with high salary numbers especially for the early stages. But those questions might be asked. So if you rolled in everything into R&D, you rolled in everything into sales and marketing, I might ask you, what's the headcount and what do those salaries look like? One thing that I did not bring up in the conversation during the team slide is corporate versus startup. I said that, look, someone who had startup experience is valuable on the executive team, but how valuable is someone who's corporate? And Hedy, I don't mean to pick on you, but you went through that. That was a live example where you guys wanted a corporate person and you wanted them bad. I think we had 2 hours because there were 2 separate sessions and 2 separate days when we had those conversations, because your team really wanted that person, and that person came with a salary that no one would ever say yes to. So what happens in those cases? You have to also look at it not just simply that investor is being a jerk, and hey, this person really cost that much money. Investors actually being reasonable in that case. Getting that high paid corporate person may be your undoing. And I've seen it over and over again in different startups. It's very tempting. Someone says yes, and there's money on the table, and they recruit someone from the corporate. And that corporate culture takes over, and all of a sudden that person needs an administrative assistant. They need help. They're not used to doing anything on their own, and their strategy is based on operating inside of the corporate, where you can tap into any budget you want. They don't know how to run lean. They actually don't know how to do a lot of things because they always had someone, if it's a straight kind of MBA path, they never had to do a lot of things that they have to if they're part of the startup. Again, a lot of times the argument is like, well, we can make connections, we can make introductions, but again, you have to be investable. And if all they're doing is making those introductions and that's why you want them, they should really be on your advisory board. they have no business being on your executive team unless they're willing to take equity and actually invest their own money. Then you can take that person because you know that's a better bet. But again, still be very careful of corporate people. If they've been in the corporate world for too long, they may just totally screw you up. Not consciously, not willingly, but they will bring that outlook. They will push for different strategy, and it'll be hard to say no to them on top of it, because they always have a quick comeback. Hey, I didn't get where I got if I didn't know what I was doing. It's hard to argue. All right, cash flow. Again, that's probably going into due diligence. Just make sure that that you are kind of looking at realistic numbers. I want to talk about milestones, because milestones, and again, this is a blurred slide for a reason, because I don't want you to look at anything. It's just an example of what it can look like. Your job is to make it look less messy. And now you're tying everything together. You're tying your team, you're tying your financials, and you're tying your milestones. So as an investor, I'm looking into milestones, and now I'm trying to understand, okay, what do you need to hit? Now, somewhere on those milestones are exit points, and you need to articulate where those exit points are. So is it pre-FDA? Is it first in human? What is it? What is that first exit potential? And it has to be backed up by other exits. What do you need to achieve to raise more money after you raised this raise? And the way you think about it is each milestone should raise your valuation, meaning your company now is more valuable. So if your milestone is getting to the first in human, that's a huge milestone, right? Because you can actually exit right then. And you can definitely raise more money. And that's the key point. If you are given a check now and there's no clear milestone, and the check that someone writes doesn't match with what funds you need to spend to achieve that milestone, again, there's a gap. There's a reason, like everyone says, the value of death for startups. It's very, very real. In a lot of cases, it just comes from like you're stuck in the middle of a milestone. You're not here, you're not there. So now you have to raise more money because you ran out of money, but you can't really raise on a higher valuation because you can't tell a story. Look, we're raising money because we asked our investors for money to achieve a certain milestone. Oops, we didn't really achieve it. We got stuck in the middle, but now we're asking you to give us more money so we can finish achieving that milestone and achieve the next one. Now, my level of confidence is tanked. So as an investor, I'm like, that's not investable. I'm more scared than excited. Now, sometimes there's a good story, and that's fine, and you can you can explain it. Economy tanked. Someone walked away, whatever. But ultimately, your financials have to line up with that milestone, and you need to justify: are you able to get ideally to the exit point? If you didn't get to the exit point, what's the next milestone you need to sort of slog through, right, and raise money for? So now I'm also looking at how much money you need for that second milestone that's coming up till the next exit. As an investor, I'm also looking how diluted I'm going to get. If you have a lot of raises to get to commercialization, or to get to the really lucrative exit, I'm worried. I'm like, it's not as investable as another startup that can get to liquidity much faster, because most startups in that space exit at this point and they only need $1 million. And looks like you might need 20 million to get all the way through if no one acquires you along the way. So those are all the things that are going on in the investor sort of mind. So what do you need to do on those lines that are blurred? Basically, you talk about the milestones you achieved. A lot of times it's your IP, right? You did your IP, you did your MVP, the minimum viable product. If you don't have your first sale, then you put down customer discovery. So a lot of times that's the best you can do to look attractive to an investor. I've done 200 interviews with surgeons. Okay, I got it. Good. It's at least something you achieved. You also put down what money you used to achieve that specific milestone. A lot of times it's founder's contribution. Now I need to know how much to achieve that milestone. The reason is multiple. I want to know that you have money that you spend on this company because you have skin in the game. The other one is I want to see how much money it takes for someone else potentially to get to the same point. Now, if you have strong IP and you're protected, then the number is not as relevant because no one can really get to where you are because you got that IP secured. But if you don't, and you only spend, let's say, 10,000 as a founder, I'm wondering, well, okay, well, I looked at your team. It's not that impressive. You only spent 10K. There's no IP. Someone can achieve the exact same thing with that 10K. Basically, am I better off giving 10K to someone else, to another team that I have more trust in? Because in a short period of time, they will achieve exactly what you've achieved. And I have a better team. So again, all those things are going through my mind as an investor. So basically, you're lining up your, if you have regulatory, you should have those milestones articulated. If you have, let's say, design freeze for a device, I want to see when that happens. I want to know when is my first in human. What else needs to happen, and I want to see it all the way to the end, really. But what I'm going to focus on the most is what is happening with my money that I'm giving you now. So this is the quick ask slide. Existing investors, you write down who invested and how much. You put down what you're asking for. You're asking for 500K, and you put down the terms, right? Those are kind of standard terms. Let's say 20% discount, 6% interest. You put down your cap. That's your valuation. And then you articulate how you will use the funds. So we'll discuss that. That's all in the milestones, but now you're kind of more explicit. So you show them the entire milestone timeline, and now you're saying this is how much, how I will spend that money. Everything needs to line up. If I were to do a Q&A and go back, and say, hey, bring up that financial slide one more time, it better line up. Because if these numbers do not line up with what you promised on the financial slide, you can shoot yourself in the foot.